This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this, and definitely not this early in the story. Because when Jordan Seaton made his commitment, it felt like more than just another top recruit picking a school. It felt like a turning point. A 5-star offensive tackle, widely considered one of the most valuable pieces in his entire class, choosing a program that was still building its identity from the ground up. That decision carried weight. It sent a message across college football that something real might be forming, something strong enough to pull elite talent away from traditional powerhouses. And for a while, it looked like that message was landing exactly how it was supposed to. A huge part of that belief came from the man leading it all. Deion Sanders wasn't just recruiting players, he was selling a vision that felt bigger than football itself. He promised exposure, development, in a culture that would challenge the old system. For players like Seaton, that pitch clearly hit home. This wasn't a backup plan or a safe choice. This was a calculated bet on something new. And when a player of that caliber buys in that early, it's usually because he sees something others don't yet. He stepped into that program not just as a recruit, but as a cornerstone. Someone expected to hold everything together while the rest of the structure was still being built around him. And that's what makes everything that followed feel so unexpected, because Seaton didn't just arrive, he contributed immediately. He took on real responsibility, started games, and became a critical part of the system from day one. There was no slow development phase, no easing into the spotlight. He was already living the role that many players wait years to reach. From the outside, it looked like the perfect alignment, an elite player maximizing his opportunity while helping elevate a program that was trying to climb back into relevance. But here's where the reality starts to separate from the dream. Because sometimes what looks perfect from the outside doesn't fully reflect what's happening inside the building. And while nothing seemed off publicly, the eventual decision to leave suggests that something, somewhere along the way, didn't match the expectations that were set at the beginning. Not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way, but in the kind of subtle ways, day-to-day ways that players truly experience. The routines, the development, the environment, the standard being set behind closed doors. And that's what makes this shift so important to pay attention to, because when a player like that, who fully bought into the vision, who embraced the role, and who was already succeeding within that system decides to walk away anyway, it forces a bigger question. Not about talent, not about opportunity, but about whether the reality of the experience truly matched the promise that brought him there in the first place. And once that question is out there, it doesn't just apply to one player anymore. And then came the moment that quietly changed everything. Not a headline-grabbing rant, not a dramatic exit interview, just a calm, controlled sit-down where Jordan Seaton chose his words carefully. But sometimes it's not about what's said loudly, it's about what's said subtly. Sitting there as a member of the LSU Tigers football, Seaton began describing his new environment, and almost immediately, people started reading between the lines. Because the way he talked about LSU didn't feel like simple praise, it felt like contrast. He spoke about structure, about discipline, about a culture built around doing more than what's required. The word extra kept coming up, not as a slogan, but as a standard. He described an environment where just showing up and handling your responsibilities wasn't enough, where the expectation was to go beyond that every single day. Training wasn't just scheduled, it was embraced. Preparation wasn't just expected, it was personal. And the way he explained it, it sounded less like something new he was adjusting to, and more like something he had been missing. Now, to be fair, Seaton never directly called out his former program. He didn't take shots at the Colorado Buffaloes, and he didn't frame his comments in a negative way. Everything was measured, professional, and respectful. But that's exactly why it stood out, because when a player like that goes out of his way to keep things neutral, yet still emphasizes how different and how demanding his new situation is, it naturally raises questions. Not because he said anything wrong, but because of what those differences might imply.
And then there were the details that made people pause even longer. Mentions of late-night workouts, extra reps on his own time, a mindset where the grind wasn't something you turned on and off, it was constant. That kind of language doesn't just appear randomly. It reflects an environment where that behavior is normal, where it's encouraged, where it's part of the identity of the program. And when fans heard that, many couldn't help but wonder, was that same standard fully present before? That's where the conversation really started to pick up. Because it wasn't just about LSU being a strong program, that part was already known. It was about the comparison that formed naturally in people's minds, without Seaton ever needing to say it directly. The idea that a player who had already experienced one system was now highlighting a completely different level of intensity somewhere else. And once that idea takes hold, it spreads quickly. Fans start connecting dots, analysts start revisiting past comments, and suddenly one interview turns into something much bigger than it was ever intended to be. And the most important part? This wasn't happening in isolation, because as people began to replay those comments and break them down, a bigger realization started creeping in. This might not be the first time a former Colorado player has hinted at something like this. And once that pattern starts to form, it becomes a lot harder to ignore. And that's where things start to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern that's getting harder to ignore, because what Jordan Seaton said on its own might not have been enough to spark this level of attention. Players transfer all the time. They praise new environments all the time. That's part of the game now. But when similar kinds of comments begin to surface more than once, when different players in different situations start describing their new programs in ways that subtly highlight what they weren't experiencing before, that's when people start paying closer attention. There's been growing buzz online, with fans and analysts pointing out that Seaton's comments don't exist in a vacuum. Reports have circulated, and it's been said in multiple discussions that other former Colorado Buffaloes football players have made remarks along similar lines after leaving the program. Not direct shots, not outright criticism, but observations about structure, development, and learning curves that seem to accelerate the moment they stepped into a different system. Now, to be clear, these are conversations happening around the program, not confirmed accusations, but the consistency and tone is what has people raising eyebrows. Because when one player says something, it's easy to dismiss. When two players say something similar, it becomes interesting. But when it starts to feel like a recurring theme, when phrases like more structured, more demanding, or learned more in a short time keep showing up in different contexts, it shifts the conversation entirely. It stops being about individual experiences and starts becoming about the environment itself. And that's where things get uncomfortable, especially for a program that's still trying to establish its identity under Deion Sanders. What makes this even more complicated is how subtle all of it is. Nobody is coming out and saying anything explosive. There are no viral moments of players calling out the program or creating headlines with direct criticism. Instead, it's the opposite. It's controlled, respectful, almost understated. But sometimes that's what makes it louder. Because when players choose their words carefully and still manage to paint a picture of something different elsewhere, it forces people to read between the lines. And once fans start doing that, the narrative begins to build on its own. And narratives, especially in college football, can take on a life of their own very quickly. Recruiting conversations start to shift. Opposing programs start using those same talking points behind closed doors. Even if none of it is officially confirmed, the perception alone can be enough to create pressure. That's the part that doesn't show up in interviews or stat sheets, the quiet impact of how a program is being talked about when players leave. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about who's coming in anymore, it's about who's leaving and what they're saying once they're gone. And right now, whether it's fair or not, there's enough smoke around this situation that people are starting to wonder if there's something real behind it. And just when that conversation was starting to gain momentum, something else added even more weight to it. And then came the part that made people stop debating and start pointing at evidence, because it wasn't just what Jordan Seaton said, it was what people could actually see. Within just a short stretch after arriving at the LSU Tigers football, Seaton looked different, leaner, sharper, more defined. Reports and program updates suggested he had dropped significant weight, trimming down from the 320 range to just over 305, while maintaining strength and improving overall conditioning. And in a position like offensive tackle, where balance, agility, and endurance are everything, that kind of transformation isn't just cosmetic, it directly impacts performance. But the physical change was only part of it. What really stood out was how he described the process behind that transformation. This wasn't framed as a quick fix or a temporary adjustment. It sounded like a complete shift in daily habits, nutrition, recovery, training intensity. Everything became more intentional. He talked about being surrounded by players who treated preparation like a lifestyle, not an obligation. And one name that kept coming up in those conversations was Will Campbell, a projected top-tier NFL talent known for his discipline and consistency. Seaton didn't just observe that standard, he leaned into it, modeling his own routine after someone who was already operating at an elite level. And then there were the small details that made the biggest impact. Stories about late-night workouts, extra reps when nobody was watching, moments where he'd see someone else pushing themselves and feel the need to match that intensity immediately. One example that stood out was him noticing a random person out running hills and taking it as a challenge, like a reminder that someone, somewhere was outworking him. That mindset doesn't come from a speech, it comes from an environment where that level of accountability becomes second nature, where effort isn't something you turn on during practice, it's something that follows you everywhere. That's what turned this into a proof point for so many watching from the outside. Because now the conversation wasn't just based on interpretation or speculation, it had visible results attached to it. A player leaves one program, enters another, and within months is talking differently, training differently, and looking physically transformed. Fair or not, that kind of shift invites comparison. It forces people to ask whether this version of Seaton could have existed in his previous environment, or if something about this new system unlocked a level that hadn't been fully tapped before. And that's where things get even more complicated for Colorado Buffaloes football. Because development is one of the most important selling points in recruiting. It's not just about getting players in the door, it's about showing them what they can become once they're inside. And when a former cornerstone player starts showing visible growth somewhere else, it doesn't just raise eyebrows, it raises expectations. Expectations that every program has to meet if they want to compete at the highest level.
And now, with both the words and the results out there for everyone to see, the conversation shifts again. Because this isn't just about one player improving anymore, it's about what that improvement might be saying about everything that came before it. And that's where this stops being about one player, one transfer, or one off-season storyline, and turns into something much bigger. Because when you step back and look at everything together, what Jordan Seaton said, the way he's developed since arriving at LSU Tigers football, and the similar tone coming from other departures, it starts pointing toward a deeper question surrounding the Colorado Buffaloes football as a whole. Not talent, not recruiting, but culture. The day-to-day environment that ultimately determines whether a program actually turns potential into results. Because here's the reality, losing players happens everywhere. Even elite programs deal with transfers. That's the nature of modern college football. But losing this kind of player, and then watching the narrative that follows, that's where it hits differently. Seaton wasn't a depth piece. He wasn't buried on the roster looking for an opportunity. He was the opportunity. A starting caliber offensive tackle with elite pedigree, already producing at a high level, and projected as a future first-round talent. Those are the exact players programs build around, not the ones they expect to replace. And when a player like that walks away, it sends a signal, whether intended or not. Now layer that with everything being said around it. Again, nothing direct, nothing explosive, just consistent hints about structure, discipline, and development elsewhere. And over time, those hints begin to shape perception. In college football, perception matters almost as much as reality. Recruits hear it, families hear it, other programs definitely hear it, and suddenly the pitch that once felt so powerful
come be part of something different, something groundbreaking under Deion Sanders, starts facing quiet resistance behind the scenes. Because belief only lasts as long as results and experiences reinforce it. That's the tension sitting under all of this right now. Colorado still has the attention. The brand is still strong. The spotlight hasn't gone anywhere. But culture isn't built through headlines or social media moments. It's built in the details players live through every single day. The workouts nobody sees, the standards nobody talks about publicly, the accountability that either exists or doesn't. And when multiple players begin describing a higher level of those things somewhere else, it forces a comparison that no program wants to deal with. And again, to keep this grounded, these are observations and conversations, not confirmed accusations. No one is stepping forward with direct claims. But in a sport like this, trends don't need official confirmation to become influential. If enough people start believing there's a gap between what's being sold and what's being experienced, that belief alone can create real consequences. Because now it's not just about development, it's about trust. Trust from recruits deciding where to spend the most important years of their careers. Trust from players already inside the program, deciding whether to stay or explore other options. And trust from the outside world, trying to figure out whether what they're seeing is a temporary growing pain or something more fundamental. And that's exactly why this next stretch matters more than ever. Because once questions about culture start circulating, there's only one way to answer them, and it doesn't happen in interviews. And now everything tightens around one central figure, Deion Sanders. Because fair or not, when questions about culture, development, and player retention start building, they don't just sit on the program, they land directly on the head coach. And this is where the situation shifts from uncomfortable to urgent. This upcoming season isn't just another step in the rebuild. It's starting to feel like a defining moment, not years down the line, not part of a long-term plan, right now. Because the margin for error has quietly disappeared. The reality is Colorado still has talent. The roster isn't empty. The brand is still one of the most talked about in college football. But none of that protects you when results don't follow. And more importantly, none of it protects you when the narrative around your program starts moving in the wrong direction. Every transfer out, every comment that hints at something better elsewhere, it chips away at the foundation that was built on belief. And belief, once shaken, is hard to fully restore without proof. That's where the pressure becomes real. Because if Colorado comes out and wins, if they stack victories, compete at a high level, and show visible growth, this entire conversation changes almost overnight. Winning has a way of silencing everything. It reframes the narrative, restores confidence, and gives players a reason to double down instead of looking elsewhere. Suddenly, the focus shifts back to momentum, to progress, to the idea that the vision is working exactly as intended. But if that doesn't happen, the opposite effect hits even harder. Because now it's not just about one player like Jordan Seaton leaving anymore. It becomes about what could happen next. And one name that keeps coming up in that conversation is Julian Lewis, a player who represents the future of the program in the same way Seaton once did. A centerpiece, a symbol of what Colorado is trying to build offensively moving forward. And when you start imagining a scenario where a player like that begins to question things, that's when the stakes reach another level entirely. Because losing a 5-star recruit after they've already bought in tells a message that echoes far beyond one roster. It tells every future recruit, every family, every high-level prospect watching from the outside that something might not be lining up the way it should. And in a sport where perception drives decisions just as much as performance, that kind of signal can be incredibly difficult to recover from. Not impossible, but difficult. That's why this season carries so much weight. It's not just about wins and losses in the standings, it's about control of the narrative. It's about proving that what's being built in Boulder isn't just loud and exciting, but sustainable, structured, and capable of producing results that match the vision. Because right now, everything feels like it's sitting on a tipping point. And what happens next won't just shape a season, it could shape the entire future of the program. And when you step back from it all, the transfer, the comments, the visible transformation, and the growing conversation around the program, it all leads to one simple but uncomfortable question. What is really going on here? Because this isn't just about Jordan Seaton anymore. His decision might have sparked the discussion, but the implications stretch far beyond one player choosing a different path. This is about perception, about trust, and about whether the reality inside a program truly matches the image being presented to the outside world. Because on one hand, there's still a lot to believe in. Deion Sanders remains one of the most influential and compelling figures in all of college football. The attention he brings, the energy he creates, and the opportunities tied to his brand are real. The Colorado Buffaloes football are still relevant, still visible, still capable of attracting top-tier talent. None of that has disappeared, and it's exactly why this situation feels so important, because the foundation is there. But on the other hand, the questions aren't going away either. Because when multiple moments start pointing in the similar direction, when players leave and describe something different, when development seems to accelerate elsewhere, when the conversation shifts from excitement to curiosity, you can't just ignore it. You can't just label it as noise and move on. At some point, it becomes something that needs to be answered, not with words, not with interviews, and not with social media clips, but with results. Real, undeniable results that show the program is evolving in the ways it needs to. And that's where everything comes full circle. Because maybe this is just part of the process. Maybe this is what a rebuild looks like before it fully clicks. Growing pains, adjustments, lessons being learned in real time. That's one possibility. But there's also another side to it. The possibility that these aren't isolated moments at all, that they're early signs of something that could become a bigger issue if it isn't addressed. And right now, nobody on the outside truly knows which one it is. That's what makes this so compelling and so important to watch. Because the next season won't just tell us how good Colorado is, it will tell us whether the vision is actually working, whether players are developing the way they're supposed to, whether the belief that brought elite talent into Boulder in the first place can still hold strong when tested. And until those answers show up on the field, the question remains open.